When we speak of reality, we often imagine something solid, external, and finished, as though the world were a completed object, waiting patiently for our eyes to fall upon it. We are trained from our earliest education to think of reality as that which exists independently of us, governed by laws that would remain exactly the same whether or not a human being were present to witness them. This view has served science remarkably well. It has allowed us to predict eclipses, to build machines, to cure diseases, and to unlock energies once thought mythical. And yet, when we look more closely, when we examine not merely the behavior of matter, but the conditions under which matter becomes meaningful to us, this simple picture begins to fracture. You may have entered this room expecting a lecture on quantum physics, or perhaps on the strange paradoxes that arise when we examine the microscopic world, but I ask you to notice something first, something immediate and undeniable. You are aware, before any equation, before any experiment, before any measurement, there is this fact: experience is happening. Sensation arise, thoughts appear, meaning forms. This awareness is not something you infer from data. It is the very medium in which all data appear. And yet, for centuries, science has attempted to explain this awareness as though it were a late and accidental byproduct of matter, a flicker produced by sufficiently complex arrangements of atoms, like heat from friction or light from combustion. I ask you to pause here, not to reject science, but to examine its hidden assumption. When we say that consciousness is produced by matter, what do we mean by matter? Matter, as science knows it, is never encountered directly. It is known only through observation, measurement, and interpretation, all of which already presuppose consciousness. The color of the table before you, the sound of my voice, the sensation of your body resting in the chair, these are not properties of matter as such. They are experiences. They are how the world appears within awareness. The world we describe with equations is an abstract reconstruction, a symbolic representation extracted from experience, not something that precedes it. This does not mean that the world is an illusion, nor that it dissolves when you close your eyes. It means something far subtler and far more profound. Reality continues beyond what you observe. But what you observe is inseparable from the conditions of observation. The act of knowing is not a passive mirror held up to a pre-existing world. It is an active participation in the unfolding of reality as it becomes experience. Quantum mechanics did not invent this problem, but it forced us to confront it without escape. When we discovered that the behavior of microscopic systems could not be fully described without reference to measurement, many physicists attempted to treat this as a temporary embarrassment, a technical inconvenience that would one day be resolved by a deeper theory. Yet decades have passed, and the problem remains, not because we lack mathematical sophistication, but because the difficulty is not mathematical at all. It is conceptual. It lies in our refusal to take consciousness seriously as a fundamental element of our description of the world. Consider how strange this refusal is. Every scientific statement you have ever accepted, every experimental result you trust, every theory you regard as true, has entered your life as an experience in consciousness. and yet consciousness itself is treated as though it were an afterthought, something to be explained away once the real work of physics is complete. This is like trying to understand music by studying the vibrations of strings while denying the existence of sound. You may object that science concerns itself with what can be measured, and that consciousness, being subjective, lies outside its domain. But this objection misunderstands the situation. Subjectivity is not an optional feature of reality that we might one day discard. It is the condition under which anything becomes measurable at all. Without experience, there is no observation. Without observation, there is no experiment. Without experiment, there is no science. To exclude consciousness from our account of reality is not an act of rigor, it is an act of amputation. In my own work, both in physics and in reflections that led beyond it, I found myself increasingly compelled by a simple yet unsettling thought. The multiplicity we observe in the world may not be fundamental. We speak of many objects, many minds, many living beings, many observers. But what if this plurality is not a property of reality itself, but of the way reality is experienced from particular perspectives? What if the world is not composed of countless separate entities, but is instead a single, indivisible whole, apprehended through countless windows? This idea is not foreign to science, though it is rarely stated so plainly. In physics, we routinely describe systems that cannot be decomposed into independent parts without losing something essential. The behavior of the whole is not merely the sum of its components. In biology, this is even more evident. A living organism is not a machine assembled from interchangeable parts. It is a dynamic unity, sustained by flows of energy and information, maintaining order against the universal tendency toward disorder. Life is not merely matter in motion, it is matter organized in a way that preserves meaning across time. When I asked, many years ago, what is life, I was not seeking a mystical answer, nor was I attempting to replace biology with philosophy. I was pointing to a gap in our understanding, a place where existing concepts fail to capture what is most essential. Living systems do not merely obey physical laws, they exploit them. They draw order from disorder, maintaining a delicate balance that cannot be understood by mechanics alone. And behind this organization lies information not as an abstract mathematical quantity, but as something that makes a difference, something that guides form and function toward continuity. And formation, in this sense, is not simply stored in molecules or encoded in structures. It is meaningful only in relation to a system that can use it, interpret it, and act upon it. And interpretation, at its root, is not a mechanical process. It is a proto-cognitive act, a primitive form of knowing. Here, again, we encounter the difficulty of trying to keep consciousness out of the picture. The more deeply we examine life, the more it resists being reduced to blind causality. You may feel, at this point, that we are drifting away from solid ground, away from the reassuring certainty of equations and measurements. But I assure you, this movement is not a retreat from clarity, it is an advance toward honesty. The clarity of science does not come from ignoring difficult questions. but from facing them without fear. And one of the most difficult questions we can ask is this: if consciousness is not merely produced by the brain, but is instead the field in which the brain itself appears, then what does this say about the nature of reality? I am not suggesting that individual minds are omnipotent creators of the universe, nor that the physical world is a dream conjured by personal imagination. That would be a misunderstanding. What I am suggesting is that the division between observer and observed, between mind and world, is not as absolute as our language makes it seem. There is a deeper level at which this division dissolves, a level at which reality is one, and the many perspectives we inhabit are expressions of that unity. At this level, the question is no longer whether reality exists independently of observation, but how reality expresses itself through observation. Each of us experiences the world from a particular vantage point, shaped by a particular body, history, and nervous system. These perspectives differ, sometimes dramatically, yet they are not isolated. They overlap, communicate, and resonate. The fact that we can share knowledge at all, that we can agree on experiments, compare results, and build a coherent picture of the world already implies a profound underlying unity. The paradoxes of quantum mechanics, including the one made famous by a hypothetical cat suspended between life and death, are not invitations to magical thinking. They are reminders that our classical intuitions, shaped by everyday experience, are inadequate guides to the foundations of reality. They force us to confront the role of the observer not as an intruder into an otherwise complete world, but as an integral participant in the way the world becomes definite. Yet even here, the paradox is often misunderstood. The cat is not the mystery. The mystery is why we ever thought that reality could be fully described without reference to experience in the first place. The so-called collapse of possibilities into a single outcome is not an event that occurs in space and time like a collision between particles. It is the transition from potential description to actual experience, from what can be said to what is lived. If this seems unsettling, it is because it challenges a deeply ingrained habit of thought, the habit of placing ourselves outside the world we seek to understand. Science taught us to step back, to remove personal bias, to let nature speak for itself. This was a necessary and fruitful discipline, but it was never meant to imply that the knower could be eliminated entirely. The attempt to do so leads not to objectivity, but to incoherence. As we move forward in this inquiry, you will notice a shift. We will continue to respect the rigor of science, but we will no longer pretend that science exhausts the meaning of reality. We will allow biology, physics, and philosophy to inform one another, not as rival explanations, but as complementary perspectives on a single, indivisible whole. And you may find that what begins as an effort to understand the world ends as an encounter with a deeper question, one that turns back upon you. For if reality is not a collection of separate things, but a unified process, expressing itself through countless forms, then life is not a trivial accident in a meaningless universe. It is one of the ways reality becomes aware of itself. And if consciousness is not a late addition to an otherwise mindless cosmos, but the ground of all experience, then the question is no longer whether the universe has meaning. The question is how meaning comes to recognize itself through you. You may notice, as we continue, that the ground beneath our discussion subtly changes. We are no longer asking what reality is made of in the ordinary sense, as though it were constructed from pieces that could be laid out on a table. We are instead approaching a quieter, more difficult question: how reality appears at all, and to whom. It is tempting, especially for those trained in science, to imagine consciousness as something that arrives late in the story of the universe. First there is matter, then chemistry, then life, then brains, and finally, almost as an afterthought, awareness flickers on. This narrative feels orderly, progressive, and satisfying, but it rests on an assumption that is rarely examined, that matter, as described by physics, is something fully formed and meaningful prior to experience. Yet physics itself undermines this assumption at every turn. The world described by equations is not the world you live in. The symbols we write on the blackboard do not smell, do not sound, do not shine with color, do not ache with longing or quiet joy. They are abstractions, immensely powerful ones, but abstractions nonetheless. They are maps, not the territory. And the territory, the lived world of experience, exists only within consciousness. This is not a poetic statement. It is a literal one. When you see a tree, what you actually encounter is not cellulose and chlorophyll arranged in space. You encounter color, shape, texture, depth. These are not properties that exist out there in isolation. They arise through a relationship between what is observed and the observing system. Remove the observer entirely, and what remains is not a colored, shaped object waiting patiently in the dark, but a theoretical construct, useful, predictive, but no longer experiential. This realization often provokes resistance. You may feel that it places too much importance on the human mind, that it risks sliding into subjectivism or even solipsism. But this reaction misunderstands the claim. The point is not that your individual mind creates the universe, but that mind, in the deeper sense of awareness itself, cannot be excluded from any complete account of reality. Consciousness is not personal in the way your biography is personal. It is not confined to your name, your memories, or your preferences. It is the field in which all such personal features appear. Here we must be careful with language, because language itself insists on division. It forces us to speak of my consciousness and your consciousness, as though awareness were something that could be neatly partitioned, like property. Yet when you examine experience directly, you never encounter consciousness as a bounded object. You encounter thought, sensation, emotion, images, but consciousness itself is simply the openness in which these appear. It has no edges. It does not announce itself. It is known only by being. This is why the idea that the world is fundamentally one, rather than many, is not an exotic metaphysical speculation, but a sober inference from experience itself. The apparent multiplicity of the world, many objects, many organisms, many observers arises within a single experiential continuum. The divisions are real at one level, indispensable for practical life and scientific description. but they are not ultimate. In physics, we encounter this again and again. We attempt to isolate systems, to treat them as independent, and we succeed only approximately. At deeper levels, interactions cannot be ignored, boundaries blur. What we call a particle is not a tiny billiard ball with a fixed identity, but an event, a process, a pattern of relationships. Identity becomes contextual. What something is depends on how it is observed, how it interacts, how it is embedded in the whole. Biology intensifies this lesson. A living organism is not merely a collection of molecules. Even though it is composed of them, it is a coherent process, maintaining itself through continuous exchange with its environment. The boundary between organism and world is permeable, dynamic, and negotiated moment by moment. Life is not a thing, it is an activity, and this activity is guided by information, not in the trivial sense of stored data, but in the deeper sense of form-preserving order. When I spoke of negative entropy, I was not proposing a mystical force that defies physics. I was pointing to a fact that demands interpretation. Living systems maintain and even increase internal order, while the surrounding environment trends toward disorder. They do this by drawing upon structured flows of energy and matter, guided by internal constraints that embody information. But information, unlike energy, is not conserved by physical law alone. It is meaningful only relative to a system that can use it. This brings us, inevitably, back to the question of knowing. A genetic code is not a code in isolation. It becomes a code only within the context of a living cell that can read it, interpret it, and act upon it. The language of life presupposes a form of understanding, however rudimentary. It is not consciousness as we experience it in reflection or self-awareness, but it is not blind mechanism either. It occupies a middle ground that our current categories struggle to articulate. Here, the mechanistic worldview reaches its limit. Mechanics can describe how parts move relative to one another. Mathematics can capture patterns with exquisite precision, but neither can explain why certain patterns persist, why organization arises and stabilizes, why life emerges at all. To say that it is a matter of chance filtered by necessity is to describe the process without touching its meaning. Meaning, again, is not an optional embellishment. It is what distinguishes a living process from a mere physical event. A heartbeat means something to the organism whose life depends on it. A signal means something to the cell that responds to it. At every level of life, there is significance, relevance, orientation toward continuation. This orientation cannot be derived from equations alone. If we now widen our perspective, the picture becomes even more striking. Human consciousness, with its capacity for reflection, language, and imagination, is not an anomaly tacked onto an otherwise indifferent universe. It is an intensification of a tendency already present in life itself, the tendency toward self-reference, toward organization that not only persists, but in some sense knows that it persists. When you become aware of yourself as aware, something remarkable occurs. The universe, through you, is no longer merely happening. It is noticing itself. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of the situation. Every thought you think, every question you ask, every attempt to understand reality is reality, engaging in an act of self-examination. This is why the insistence on separating subject and object, mind and world, ultimately fails. It fractures a unity that, at a deeper level, remains intact. The observer is not outside the universe looking in. The observer is an expression of the universe, localized, embodied, and perspective-bound, yet participating in a process that transcends any single viewpoint. The discomfort many feel when confronted with this idea often stems from a fear of losing objectivity. But objectivity, properly understood, is not the absence of subjectivity. It is the disciplined coordination of perspectives. Science achieves its power not by eliminating the observer, but by creating methods through which observations can be shared, compared, and stabilized across many minds. This very possibility points again to an underlying unity that makes communication meaningful. You might now ask if reality is one and consciousness is fundamental. Why does the world appear fragmented? Why do we experience ourselves as separate individuals, often isolated, often in conflict? The answer lies not in the nature of reality itself, but in the conditions of embodiment. Each living organism occupies a particular location in space and time. It has a nervous system tuned to certain signals and blind to others. It constructs a world sufficient for survival. Not a total picture of existence. Your experience, then, is a perspective, not a prison. It is limited, but not disconnected. The very fact that you can sense these limits, that you can ask questions that exceed your immediate concerns, already indicates that you are not confined to them. Through reflection, through science, through philosophy, you reach beyond the narrow window of individual perception toward a more comprehensive understanding. And yet, no matter how far you extend this understanding, it will always return you to the same place, the immediacy of experience. You cannot step outside consciousness to verify it, because there is no outside in which such a step could occur. Consciousness is not an object among objects. It is the condition that makes objects appear. This realization does not close inquiry. It deepens it. It invites a different kind of humility, one that recognizes the power of science without mistaking it for the final word on existence. It invites us to see physics, biology, and philosophy not as competing explanations, but as layers of description, each appropriate to a different aspect of a single, indivisible reality. As we continue, the question will shift again. We will no longer ask merely how consciousness relates to the world, but what it means for the world to be conscious at all, not as a person is conscious, but as a unified process in which knowing and being are inseparable. And you may begin to sense that what is at stake is not an abstract theory, but your own place within this unfolding whole. For if the universe is not a collection of dead things, accidentally producing life and mind, but a living continuum expressing itself through form, then your awareness is not a spectator. It is a participant, and the deepest question is no longer what is reality made of, but what is reality doing? Here, now, through the fact that you are aware, That question does not demand an answer in words. It demands a change in how you listen, how you observe, and how you understand your own existence within the vast, unified movement of life and consciousness. As we move further, something subtle but decisive must be acknowledged. Up to this point, we have spoken of consciousness as fundamental, of life as irreducible to mechanism, of reality as a unified whole experienced through many perspectives. Yet there remains a temptation quiet, persistent, to treat these ideas as elegant interpretations layered on top of science, rather than as implications that press back upon science itself, reshaping how we understand what it is we are studying. Let us resist that temptation. If consciousness is not a byproduct, but a condition, then the universe is not merely a stage on which awareness accidentally appears. The universe is, in some profound sense, already oriented toward appearance, toward manifestation, toward being known. This does not mean that stars think or atoms reflect. It means something far more restrained and far more unsettling, that the distinction between being and knowing is not as absolute as we once believed. In physics, we are accustomed to describing the world from the outside. We speak of systems, states, variable, initial condition. We imagine ourselves standing at a distance, recording outcomes. This stance has yielded extraordinary success, but it also conceals something essential. There is no outside from which the universe is observed. Every observation occurs within the universe, through structures that are themselves products of cosmic evolution. The observer is not an intrusion into reality. The observer is one of reality's most refined expressions. This is where the language of life becomes indispensable. For life is the bridge between blind physical process and reflective awareness. It is not a sudden leap, but a gradual intensification. In living systems, matter begins to organize itself in ways that preserve identity across chain. A rock erodes and becomes something else. A living organism repairs itself, resists dissolution, and maintains continuity. This continuity is not imposed from outside, it arises from within the system itself. Such behavior cannot be captured fully by equations that treat time as reversible and indifferent. Life introduces directionality. It cares about its own persistence. It distinguishes between what supports it and what threatens it. In doing so, it introduces value into the universe, not moral value in the human sense, but biological significance. Something matters. Once something matters, the universe is no longer merely unfolding. It is responding. When human consciousness emerges, this responsiveness turns inward. The organism not only acts to preserve itself, it becomes capable of representing itself to itself. It can ask what it is doing. It can doubt, imagine, regret, hope. At this point, reality does something unprecedented. It reflects upon its own activity. You might be tempted to say that this reflection is confined to the human brain, that it is a local phenomenon with no bearing on the structure of the universe as a whole. But this view underestimates the implication of emergence. If the universe can give rise to beings who question the universe, then questioning is not foreign to reality. It is one of the ways reality unfolds. This is why I have always resisted the idea that science and philosophy occupy separate, non-overlapping domains. Science, when pursued honestly, leads inevitably to philosophical questions, not because it is incomplete, but because it is thorough. When you follow explanation far enough, you encounter assumptions that can no longer be justified by measurement alone. You encounter questions about meaning, unity, and existence that cannot be answered by calculation, yet cannot be dismissed without contradiction. Consider again the notion of information. In modern science, information has become a central concept, linking physics, biology, and computation, but information is never free-floating. It is always information for something. A pattern is informative only if it makes a difference to a system capable of responding to it. This relational character cannot be eliminated without emptying the concept of its content. At the deepest level, information implies interpretation. Interpretation implies perspective. Perspective implies awareness. We circle back again and again to the same point, not as a dogma, but as a convergence. This convergence suggests that consciousness is not an anomaly to be explained away, but a clue to the nature of reality itself. It suggests that reality is not exhausted by third-person descriptions, no matter how precise. There is a first-person dimension that cannot be reduced without remainder, because it is the dimension in which all reduction takes place. Here, a misunderstanding often arises. To acknowledge the primacy of consciousness is not to deny the reality of the physical world. It is to deny that the physical world, as described by abstract models, is ontologically prior to experience. The models depend on experience for their meaning. They are tools, not foundations. If this feels like a reversal, it is because it is one for centuries. We have attempted to ground knowledge in what is supposedly most objective, most external, most detached from the knower, yet this strategy quietly presupposes what it seeks to exclude: a knowing subject capable of understanding, trusting, and applying these descriptions. The alternative is not to abandon objectivity, but to deepen it. A deeper objectivity recognizes that the observer is part of the system observed, and that understanding must therefore be reflexive. It must include the conditions of its own possibility. This reflexivity changes how we think about death, individuality, and separation. If consciousness is not confined to the personal ego, but is instead the field in which personal identity arises, then the fear of annihilation begins to loosen its grip. What ends is not awareness itself, but a particular pattern through which awareness expressed itself. The wave subsides, but the ocean does not vanish. This is not a consolation offered by religion. It is a sober implication of taking experience seriously. The sense of being a separate, isolated self is tied to the boundaries of the body and the narrative of memory. These are real and important, but they are not ultimate. They are forms through which a deeper unity becomes articulate. You may notice, as you listen, a quiet shift in how you relate to your own thoughts. They no longer appear as possessions, but as events. They arise, linger, dissolve. You did not create them deliberately. nor do you control their passing. In this simple observation, something profound is revealed. The self you habitually identify with is not the source of consciousness, but one of its expressions. This does not diminish you. It situates you. To be situated is to belong to the body, to life, to the unfolding of reality itself. Your questions, your doubts, your search for understanding are not deviations from nature's course. They are continuations of it. The universe, through you, is not merely existing, it is wondering. As we approach the final movement of this inquiry, the emphasis will shift once more not toward answers, but toward orientation. What does it mean to live in a world where life and consciousness are not accident, but intrinsic features of reality? How does this understanding alter the way you see knowledge, responsibility, and your own participation in existence? These are not questions to be solved. They are questions to be inhabited, and in inhabiting them, you may find that what you sought as an explanation gradually reveals itself as a way of seeing one in which the boundary between observer and observed grows thinner, and reality begins quietly to recognize itself through the simple fact that you are aware. As we arrive at this final movement, there is a risk. I want to avoid the risk of turning what has been an inquiry into a conclusion, as though the matter could now be closed, summarized, or resolved. Reality does not submit to closure so easily. If anything, what has unfolded here should leave you less certain than when you arrived, yet more oriented, more precisely situated within the mystery you are part of. Up to now, we have followed a quiet thread from matter to life, from life to awareness, from awareness to the recognition that knowing and being cannot be cleanly separated. What remains is not another theory, but a shift in stance, a different way of inhabiting the world. If consciousness is fundamental, then your experience is not a private anomaly floating atop an indifferent universe. It is one of the ways the universe comes to itself. This statement sounds grand only because we are accustomed to thinking of ourselves as small and accidental, but size is irrelevant here. A mirror does not need to be large to reflect a vast landscape. It needs only to be clear. You live within a body, with limits, vulnerabilities, and an inevitable end. Nothing we have said dissolves these facts. And yet, the meaning of these facts changes when they are seen as expressions rather than confinement. The body becomes not a container for consciousness, but a localization of it, a way in which the undivided whole takes on a particular perspective. Perspective is not a flaw in reality. It is how reality becomes articulated. Through perspective, there is contrast. Through contrast, there is meaning. Through meaning, there is experience. Without limitation, nothing would appear. Without boundaries, there would be no form. The error lies not in having a perspective, but in mistaking it for the whole. Modern life quietly encourages this mistake. It trains you to identify with function, role, and measurements. You become what you do, what you produce, what you are seen to be. Knowledge becomes accumulation. Understanding becomes control. And gradually, without noticing, you begin to live as though reality was something external to be managed. rather than something intimate to be participated in. Science, ironically, both fuels and corrects this tendency. It gives you extraordinary power over the material world. Yet it also reveals, when taken seriously, that the world resists being reduced to an object. At the foundations of physics, the certainty dissolves into probability. At the foundations of biology, mechanism gives way to organization and meaning. At the foundations of knowledge itself, the observer reappears, unavoidable. This reappearance is not a failure of science. It is its maturation, to recognize that reality continues beyond what you observe is not to retreat into mysticism. It is to acknowledge that observation is a relation, not an extraction. The world you know is always the world as experienced. Shaped by the conditions of knowing, there may be, and indeed must be, aspects of reality that exceed any particular observation. But these aspects are not alien to experience. They are its depth. Here, the famous paradox of the cat serves its final purpose, not as a puzzle about boxes and poison, but as a reminder of humility. The paradox arises only when we insist on applying categories forged in the macroscopic world to a domain where they no longer belong. It reminds us that our concepts are tools, not mirrors of ultimate reality. When the tools break down, the task is not to force them harder, but to listen. Listening, in this sense, is not passive. It is an active openness to being corrected by reality itself. If you listen carefully, you may notice that the deepest questions you ask about the universe are inseparable from questions about yourself. When you ask what exists, you are also asking what it means to know. When you ask how life arises, you are also asking what it means to live. When you ask whether consciousness is fundamental, you are also asking what you truly are. These questions cannot be answered once and for all, because they are not external problems. They are expressions of a process that is ongoing. The universe does not arrive at self-knowledge in a single stroke. It explores itself through countless forms, countless lives, countless moments of awareness. Your life is one such moment. This does not grant you cosmic importance in the sense of dominance or privilege. It grants you participation. To participate is to matter, not because you are central, but because you are involved. Your choices, your attention, your way of seeing all of these are ways in which reality shapes itself locally. When you understand this, responsibility acquires a different tone. It is no longer merely about rules or outcome. It is about alignment, about whether your way of living reflects the depth you dimly sense, or whether it reduces existence to surfaces and calculations. Knowledge, too, changes its character. It becomes less about possession and more about relationship. You do not stand above the world, mastering it through concept. You stand within it, learning to resonate with its patterns. Understanding becomes a form of participation, not domination, and death, which casts its long shadow over all inquiry, loosens its grip not because it disappears, but because it is seen in context. What ends is a configuration, a perspective, a story told through a particular body. What does not end is the capacity for experience itself. the field in which stories arise and fade. The universe has not exhausted its possibilities in you, nor has it begun with you. Seen this way, fear gives way to a quieter recognition. You are not alone in a meaningless expanse. You are not a stranger in an alien world. You are a way the world has learned to feel, to question, to wonder. So you may leave this lecture with fewer answers than you expected. That is as it should be. But if you leave with a different relationship to your own awareness, with a sense that when you look out at the world is also, in some subtle sense, looking back through you, then something essential has occurred. You came here to understand science. You leave carrying a deeper question. Not what is reality, but how is reality knowing itself? Here, now, as this moment of awareness you call your own. That question does not seek to be solved. It seeks to be lived.